Germany had a population of 69 million people at the outset of World War II, and with the Anschluss in 1938, that figure rose to 84 million. The British, who saw themselves as facing this combined enemy of Germany and Austria, had 47 million people. And as a consequence, they saw themselves as being at a manpower deficit that was something they had to overcome, not only for this conflict, but for future conflicts about which they were very concerned. As you know, planning for war also includes the planning for the peace. And one of the things that the British were doing as early as 1940 was planning for the next conflict that they anticipated would come within a generation against Middle European powers. There was an official campaign to mobilize women for the workforce because of this manpower deficit. And this campaign included focus on both single and married women, and that included married women with children. One of the difficulties was to get war factories to operate on a schedule that would accommodate the lifestyle of women who had children and who, for whom largely the husband was going to be absent from the home. Women worked in war factories. They also worked in civil defense, and they were drafted into auxiliary branches of the services, especially the ATS, which is the Auxiliary Territorial Service. It was exclusively a women's sort of interior army, like the National Guard, but it was for women only. The government chimed in to help with this project by providing child care for working women who had children, and creating nurseries to hold those children while the women were away working. There were hundreds of these nurseries founded. They were founded all over Britain, but especially in the southeast, where it was thought the population was most vulnerable to bombing from the Luftwaffe. Children were also evacuated from London, as I'm sure you know, but perhaps you're not aware that that pregnant women were also evacuated from the Greater London area and were moved to the northeast of Britain for safety purposes and in order to have children. They were taken to country homes that were requisitioned specifically for the purpose, and at least the figures from 1941 that I was able to find indicate that 25,000 young citizens were born in these homes by June of 1941. So thousands of women were being relocated in order to have safe birthing procedures in rural areas, away from, again, the main targets of German bombing. The task was to create a fighting population that would be prepared for this further engagement that they expected within another generation. There was a countervailing message to this push for more children, and that came from eugenicists who also wrote to the British medical press. They advocated sterilization, especially for feeble-minded women. Of course, no definition was given for that. And these eugenicists argued for and urged intellectuals to have more children to compensate for the losses of the feeble-minded families that would now no longer be born. Some of these letters are for our reading now, truly disturbing. They read as a very disturbing set of texts. But the government continued to give incentives for more children to be born. And they did this in lots of different ways. They gave family allowances. They gave tax credits, similar to the way the United States does now. They provided more food for children, special rations, and milk at schools. All of this was to increase the number of children who were being born or being planned to be born. There were private initiatives as well. In 1945, the London Women's Parliament was held. It was a group of women meeting to protest that there were so few women in the actual parliament, and they endorsed the idea of having larger families and at earlier stages of life. There was also in 1946, after the war, a national conference on maternity and child welfare, which made the same proclamations, asking for the increase in planning for families. They talked about the planning for mothercraft as well, so how children would actually be treated when they were finally arrived and as part of the family. In all of this, the women who were not having children become victimized. They were held by British physicians to be unpatriotic. Their infertility was seen as bad planning or physical infirmity or, in fact, disability. And something had to be done. The British medical press reveals that the idea of parenthood had become culturally mandatory in wartime Britain. And it was a form of war service, really. So the question was how to increase fertility in women during this time period. Tests were conducted on infertile women using hormone therapy. Discussions of these tests are laid out in the British medical press. There was some success, but of course there were a number of side effects that were undesirable. And so a new approach was developed as of 1946. That approach was what we call artificial insemination, or AI. The British called it assisted insemination. This would happen in a hospital or clinic setting, never at home, and would address the problems of impotency, of psychological problems between couples, and other forms of dystopia, I guess you could say, in between couples who were not successful in having children. The result of these tests was a number of different things, but one of them was in 1948, a commission was convened by the Archbishop of Canterbury to look into the legal and moral issues associated with assisted fertilization. The Archbishop of Canterbury's commissioners found that to assist marital relations using the husband's sperm was all right, but if the donor was not the husband, the practice was seen as a violation of marriage union. I'd be happy to take questions on this paper, which I was unable to conclude under time. Thank you. I thought I heard your buzz. No? I've got 5 more minutes? Okay, well, let me say a little bit more about this Archbishop of Canterbury's meeting then. Maybe that was someone's phone.
I'm there before.
That's okay. It's quite all right. The commission that was convened publicized its findings all over Britain in the mainstream press, and also it was picked up in the medical press. The idea was espoused by the group that assisted insemination was contrary to Christian standards. And this is the Anglican Church we're talking about. So that, of course, held some water. The evils involved, quote unquote, were so grave that, quote, it should be made illegal, unquote. That was the finding of the unanimous finding of the Archbishop of Canterbury's commission. The commission also claimed that it should be made illegal, and if it was not already illegal under the Perjury Act of 1921, in which doctors were thought to could be seen as accomplices to adultery, and they could serve, it was thought, 7 years in prison. Something called the Medical Defense Union was formed in order to prevent exactly this problem, the legal problem of doctors being involved in the creation of children. The Medical Defense Union wrote to both the Lancet and the British Journal of Medicine, publicly opposing assisted insemination, and its idea was to protect practitioners from lawsuits. That was its purpose, was to make sure that doctors were held immune if they should be interested in participating in this kind of activity. The standard press, the mainstream press, found that the Archbishop of Canterbury becoming involved in suggesting what should be legal and what should be illegal was in fact a kind of tyranny of the church over what was in fact a secular matter, and the church should not be involved in even espousing any opinion about it. Assisted insemination was, in at least one case, successful and then followed by a divorce. And this created a storm of letters to the British medical press asking the question, was the child legitimate or not? The courts to which this question was brought were not able to decide, and there was instead a great deal of discussion about the matter when it was left unresolved before 1950. There was a request in December 1948 for the House of Commons to establish a royal commission on artificial insemination. This is how serious it had become as an issue, and the hope was that they would establish some kind of legislative framework for the use of this new technology. But in fact, that did not happen until 1971 in Britain. The sense of sin that I talked about in the title is a phrase that comes from a British physician's written remarks about women choosing whether or not to have children. Children were thought during the wartime and immediate post-war era to be morally required for the good of the state. And the sense of sin was basically upon those who decided not to have sex. Thank you very much.
So definitely have time for questions.
Okay, I'm happy to take any questions. Sure.
So as a Russian historian,
Yes.
a totally self-interested question, which is that in these discussions about population, were there comparisons also made between the British size of the British population and the size of the Russian or Soviet population?
There were comparisons made between the birth rates of the two countries, less so than the actual standing population. The birth rate in Britain in 1941 was the lowest ever on record. In Germany, it was the birth rate was, my notes tell me 20.3 per 1,000 population. The British rate was 15.0 per 1,000 population. The highest population growth areas were Russia, Italy, and Japan. Now, if you think about those three countries having the highest rate of births in 1939 and 1940, there's significant difficulty on the part of the British to measure up and look squarely at a future conflict without fear. They had a lower birth rate and a lower standing population to begin with. I tried to look up what contemporary birth rates are for Britain and for Germany. I didn't look for Russia, but they're calculated very differently now than they were then, and so the numbers wouldn't line up anyway. Sorry about that.
So I'm thinking about the last paper from the last session. I don't know if you heard it. Did anybody care whether these babies were born, I hate this term, but in or out of wedlock?
Yes. One of the problems was that on the horizon, the British practitioners could see a day would come when unmarried women would be able to have artificial insemination and therefore have a child without the assistance of a man or without a man in the picture. And it even went beyond that. There was also the suggestion in a 1950 letter to the British medical press that two women together in a partnership could have a child without a male being involved. And this raised the specter, obviously, of legitimizing lesbian relationships with children. And in that way, the problem was one that wasn't beginning to be understood and encountered.
Okay, but you're still talking about two situations of what I would call intelligent choice. What about just garden variety girls getting knocked up? Were their children okay as population fodder?
Yes, although there was an idea that the British wanted the fittest to fight.
Okay.
And so that goes back to the sort of the eugenicists' claims about problems with having feeble-minded people in charge of the defense of Britain. They were worried about that and so wanted to sterilize women. There was no suggestion about sterilizing men, by the way. Sure.
Okay, yeah, it goes along what you just said, sort of like the expectations for women and the expectations of men and how they differ. You mentioned that women were sort of like, I don't know if discriminated against is too strong a term, but if you didn't choose to have a child for Britain, then you were not necessarily considered to be very productive for your nation.
Right.
Can you say more about how they were discriminated against and whether that only sort of like, whether that only hit women or whether men that couldn't produce basically a child with a woman also faced similar discrimination?
Men face the problem in terms of being labeled impotent, which suggested that they might be open to different therapies that had not been proven. There was the idea that experimentation might be conducted to improve men's sperm motility and other features that had to do with their success as fathers. The one thing that's missing for both men and women in this exchange is any kind of therapy, any kind of discussion about why they were childless in the first place, and any kind of dialogue, as Howard was mentioning before, about the issues of relationship. Those were kept pretty much away. Women were discriminated against in fairly clear terms. They were given less pay at work. They were recruited to more difficult jobs and put at greater risk while they were at work in war factories. So, thank you.